Don't Pick Brian by Anne Harth. Don't pick Brian. He's afraid of the ball. Brian heard the whispers. His face felt warm. He shuffled his feet. Janie, Peter pointed. Janie skipped over to stand with Peter's team. Theo, Amy said. You're with us. Theo stood behind Amy. The group of kids waiting grew smaller. Soon Brian stood alone. Brian, you're on Amy's team, Mr. Rich said. Okay, listen up. We're doing something different today. Brian sighed. What now? Today, we will run relay races. Brian heard some groans. Running, it had to be better than softball. Line up, teams, Mr. Rich said. Amy stood at the front of their line. Everyone wanted to be first. Brian was last. Mr. Rich pointed to the other side of the field. Do you see that orange cone out there? Everyone looked. Everyone nodded. When I blow this whistle, tweet, you can start. The first person runs around the cone and back here. Tag the next person in line. Then that person will go. The team that finishes first wins. Mr. Rich lifted his weight. Got that? Everyone nodded. Ready? Mr. Rich raised the whistle to his lips. Brian stood on one foot and then the other. Tweet! Amy and Peter took off. Go, Amy! Run, Peter! Peter was faster. He raced back around the cone and headed back. Amy wasn't far behind. They pounded back to the start. Peter tagged the next person. Amy tagged hers. The next two raced away. Brian felt his heart beat faster. There were only 5 people in front of him. Could he do this? Would he lose it for his team? Brian would run against Janie. She was fast. The kids shouted and yelled. Brian was quiet. There were only 2 people to go. Theo was in front of Brian. He was ready. Theo took off. He raced around the cone and headed back. Peter's team was still ahead. Brian's stomach hurt. He was ready. Theo pounded toward him. Brian held out his hand. Theo slapped it. Go, he shouted. Brian went. Janie was ahead. Her braids flew behind her. Brian dug his feet into the ground. He ran as fast as he could. He looked up. Janie seemed to be closer. Brian ran harder. He raced around the cone. Janie was so close. He could almost touch her. He ran even faster. Come on, Brian, his team yelled. They cheered. They clapped. You can do it, Brian. Brian pushed harder. He passed Janie and crossed the finish line. Amy's team wins. Mr. Rich lifted his weight. Now, he said, let's make up the teams. The kids stood together in a group. Theo and Janie are the new captains. Brian stood in the middle of the group. He heard the whispers. Pick Brian. He's the best runner. Brian grinned. What lessons do the other students learn because of Brian? The other students learned that looks can be deceiving and sometimes you can't judge people all the time. And the theme of the passage is to not judge people before you get to know them. And how did Brian feel when he heard the whispers? Well, at first he was kind of scared and he felt bad because people were whispering that they didn't want him. But at the end of the story, they were whispering that they really wanted him to be on their team, so he felt better. All right, Fabian, I hope you enjoyed that story. We'll have a couple more later on. Stay safe.